So you're telling me you're doing an article on the infrastructure bill or Build Back Better, et cetera, and you're not going to mention the enormous amount of money that every lobbyist spent on that bill? That's absurd. That's absurd. That's 98% of the ballgame. And the reason they hide the ball is because they don't want you to know this whole thing is based on the money that they are receiving.
In this clip, Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks goes on Lex Fridman's podcast. The whole thing is 4 hours long, which you can find on Lex Fridman's channel. Cenk has probably done this on the Young Turks as well. I haven't checked that out recently. But in this clip, we're focusing on their conversation about corruption, money, and politics. And it's really interesting. I've done another video on this where they talk about conspiracy theories. But, however you feel about Cenk Uygur, which has changed. He's been doing this a long time. But since the election, there's been some drama, which we can go into another time. Anyway, I'm going to watch this with you. I'm going to have my opinions, and then I want to know what you think in the comments. But let's check it out together.
So, for example, in the primaries, both in 2020 and 2024, if you said the senator from MBNA, I guarantee you almost no one in the audience has heard of it. If you heard of it, good job. You know politics really well, okay? But the reason you didn't hear of it is because the mainstream media wouldn't say that's outrageous of Joe Biden to be such a corporate stooge. They'd say that's outrageous of you to point out something that's true and something we reported on earlier, okay? And so they protected him at all costs. Now, finally, when you get to this version of Joe Biden, he can't talk, he can't walk, he bears no resemblance to the young guy who came in saying that money in politics was a problem. Now he's saying money in politics is the solution. And in 2020, he said, well, I can raise more money than Bernie. I can kiss corporate ass better than Bernie. I'm the biggest corporate ass kisser in the world, so I'm going to raise $1 billion and you need to support me. Now, of course, he doesn't say it in those words, but that was a message to the establishment. And Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Obama, Clyburn, everybody goes, oh, that's right. Oh, Biden, not Bernie. I don't know that there's anybody in the country who instinctually dislikes Bernie more than Barack Obama.
Oh, that's an interesting. I'm not taking that tangent at this moment. Because you mentioned mainstream media. What's the motivation for mainstream media to be corporatist also?
So first of all, they're giant corporations. So they're all multi-billion-dollar corporations. In the old days, we had incredible number of media outlets. So you go to San Francisco, there'd be at least 2 papers, and there'd be a paper boy, and I'm going all the way back, paper boy on each corner, and they're competing with one another. Literally, they'd be catty corner, right? And one guy's going, oh, here are all this details. They're trying to get an audience. They're trying to get people interested. So they're populist, they're interesting, they're muckrakers, they're challenging the government. Fast forward to now, or not now, but about a decade ago, 5 years ago, in that ballpark. Now there's only 6 giant media corporations left, and it's an oligopoly, right? And they're all multi-billion-dollar corporations. They all want tax cuts. Half of them are also, especially about 20 years ago during the Iraq War, half of them are defense contractors. So they're just using the news as marketing to start wars like the Iraq War. And then GE, which owned MSNBC, makes a tremendous amount of money. So much more money from war than it does from media, that media is a good marketing spend for these corporations. Now, that's part of it, that they themselves want the same exact thing as the rest of corporations do for corporate rule, lower tax cuts, deregulation so they can merge, etc. But the second part of it is arguably even more important. So where does all that money in politics go? So for example, in 2022, it's just a midterm election, no presidential, should be lower spending. A ridiculous $17 billion are spent, okay, on the election cycle. Where does the $17 billion go? Almost all of it goes into corporate media, mainstream media, television, newspapers, radio. They're buying ads like nuts. So we have a reporter at TYT, David Schuster. He used to work at MSNBC, Fox News, etc. And David once did a piece about money in politics at a local NBC news station. And his editor or GM spiked the story. And David goes into his office and asks him, so why? This story is true. It's a huge part of politics. If we're going to report on this issue, we got to tell you what's actually happening. So he says, David, come here. He puts his arm around his shoulders, takes him to the big newsroom. And he goes, you see all this? Money in politics paid for that.
That's really fascinating. So big corporations are giving money to politicians through different channels, and then the politicians are spending that money on mainstream media. And so there's a vicious cycle where it's in the interest of the mainstream media not to criticize the very corporations that are feeding that cycle. So it's not actually direct. It's not like corporations are, because I was thinking one of the ways is direct advertisement. Like pharmaceuticals obviously advertise a lot on mainstream media, but there's also indirect, which is like giving the politicians money, or super PACs, and the super PACs and spend money on the.
That's why mainstream media never talks about the number one factor in politics, which is money. Like we all know, I mean, as we talked about earlier, we see it with our own eyes, open auction, any country, any company, anybody that has money, the politicians will now literally say, I am now working for this guy, as Trump says, because he gave me a strong endorsement, which means a lot of money, right? And the press never covers it, almost never, right? So you're telling me you're doing an article on the infrastructure bill or Build Back Better, et cetera, and you're not going to mention the enormous amount of money that every lobbyist spent on that bill? That's absurd. That's absurd. That's 98% of the ball game. And the reason they hide the ball is because they don't want you to know this whole thing is based on the money that they are receiving. And by the way, that one more thing about that, Lex, it's that the ads themselves actually, they work, and they work pretty well, but that's not the main reason you spend money on ads. You spend the money in ads to get friendly coverage from the content, from the free media that you're getting from that same outlet. And so since every newspaper and every news television station and network knows that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are their top clients, they're going to get billions of dollars from them. They never really criticize the Republican and Democratic Party. On the other hand, if you're an outsider, they'll rip your face off.
That's also really interesting. So if you're an advertiser, if you're big pharma and you're advertising, it's not that the advertisement works. It's that the hosts are too afraid, not like explicitly, just even implicitly. They're self-censoring. They're not going to have any guests that are like controversial anti-big pharma, or they're not going to make any jokes about big pharma. They're not going to make, and that continues and expands. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Sometimes it's super direct. When I was a host on MSNBC, I had a company that I was criticizing in my script, and management looked at it. And by the way, I used to go off prompter a lot, and it drove them crazy. Not because I wasn't good at it. I think my ratings went up whenever I went off prompter, but because they couldn't pre-approve the script. And what do they want to pre-approve? Hey, are you going to criticize one of our sponsors, one of our advertisers, etc.? So we had a giant fight over it, and the compromise was I moved them lower in the script, but kept them in the story, right? So sometimes it's super direct like that, but way more often it's implicit, it's indirect. You don't have to say it, right? So I give you a spectacular example of it so that you get a sense of how it works implicitly. So since GE is a giant defense contractor, they own MSNBC at the time of the Iraq War. They fired everyone who was against the Iraq War on air. So Phil Donahue, Jesse Ventura, Ashley Banfield. But Ashley Banfield, they did something different with, okay? She was a rising star at the time. She goes and gives a speech in Kansas, not really even having a policy position, but just talking about the actual costs of this Iraq war and how we should be really careful. They hate that. So they take their rising star and they take her off air. Okay. And she goes, okay, good. Let me out of my contract. It's okay. I'll go, because she was such a star at that time. She could have easily gotten somewhere else. And they go, no, we're not going to let you out of your contract. Why not? You're going to pay me to do nothing? Yeah. Not only that, we're moving your office. Where are you moving it to? They literally moved it into a closet. Okay. And they made sure that everybody in the building saw her getting taken off the air and moved into a closet. The closet is the memo, right? That's the memo to the whole building. You better shut up and do as you're told. Okay. So that way I don't have to tell you and get myself in trouble. It's super obvious. There are guardrails here, and you are not allowed to go beyond acceptable thought. And acceptable thought is our sponsors are great, politicians are great, the powerful are great.
So how do we begin to fix that? And what exactly are we fixing? Is it the influence of the lobbyists, the influence of it feels like there's companies have found different ways to achieve influence, right? So how do we get money out of politics?
That is in fact the $64,000 question. Let's see what Cenk has to say.
So it's very difficult, but doable, and we will do it. So, but in order to do it, the populist left and the populist right have to unite because, and by the way, that is why we have the culture wars.
That's why you're voting for Trump.
No chance. Okay, so we can get into that in a minute. So the culture wars are meant to divide us. If we get united, we have enough leverage and power to be able to do it. But you can't do it through a normal bill because if you do it in a bill, the whole point of capturing the Supreme Court was to make sure that they kill any piece of legislation that would protect the American people.
You're saying the Supreme Court is also captured by this?
Oh, 100%. So, okay. So let me explain. Again, people, for the uninitiated, they think, oh, that sounds conspiratorial. Well, in this case, that's actually somewhat true because people now know about this. It's the Powell memo, right? The most infamous political memo in history. Lewis Powell writes a memo for the Chamber of Commerce in 1971. That's basically a blueprint for how the Chamber of Commerce can take over the government. And Lewis Powell explains one of the most important things you have to do is take over the media. But even more important than that is taking over the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of what is allowed and not allowed. And he says, we need, quote, activist judges to help business interests on the court. Okay.
Wow. Any of that sound familiar?
And then Nixon reads the memo and goes, well, that sounds like a really good idea. How about I put you on the Supreme Court? And he puts Lewis Powell, the guy who wrote the memo, on the Supreme Court, where he's the deciding vote in Bellotti and Buckley. So Bellotti's those two decisions are 76 and 78. And what they say is, yeah, I read the Constitution and it says that money is speech. No, it isn't. And no, it didn't. That's not even close to true. They just made it up. And they said, okay, and corporations, they're human beings. No, they're not. That's preposterous, right? And they have the same inalienable rights as human beings and citizens do. And money is speech, and speech is an inalienable right. So corporations can spend unlimited money in politics. And there goes our democracy, gone. Okay. So Citizens United just shot a dead horse with a Gatling gun and made it worse and put it on steroids, but it was already dead in 78. So that's why every chart you see for the rest of your life, you'll see this, every chart about the American economy starts to diverge in 1978. So until 38 to 78, we have golden 40 years of economic prosperity. We create the greatest middle class the world has ever seen. And our productivity is sky high, but our wages match our productivity. After 78, productivity is still sky high, best in the world. Okay, sometimes people, the American worker's lazy. Not remotely true. We work our ass off, okay? But wages flatline. And they've been flatlining for about 50 years straight. And the reason is because the Supreme Court made bribery legal. So in order to get past the Supreme Court, you only have one choice. That's an amendment. And so you have to get an amendment. Amendments are very difficult. But so, for example, you need 2/3 of Congress to even propose the amendment. So, well, why would Congress propose an amendment that would take away their own power, right? Because almost everybody in Congress got there through corruption. Their main talent is, I can kiss corporate ass better than you can, right? So they take the most amount of money. A person with more money in Congress wins 95% of the time, right? But the good news is the Founding Fathers were geniuses, and they put in a second outlet. They said, or 2/3 of the states can call for a convention where you can propose an amendment. And after an amendment is proposed, then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. That's what makes it so difficult, because getting 3/4 of the states, there's so many red states, so many blue states, getting 3/4 of the states to agree is near impossible. But there is one issue that the whole country agrees on, 93% of Americans believe that politicians serve their donors and not their voters. So this is the one thing we can unite on. If we unite on this, we push our states to call for a convention. We all go to the convention together. We bring democracy alive, and we propose amendments to the Constitution. The best amendment gets 3/4 of the states to ratify. You go above the Supreme Court, and you solve the whole thing.
So if 93% of people want this, why hasn't it happened yet? I mean, the obvious answer is there's corporate control of the media and the politicians, but it seems like our current system and the megaphone that a president has, you should be able to kind of unite the populace left and right. So it shouldn't be that difficult to do. Like, why hasn't a person like Trump, who's a billionaire, or on the left, a rich businessman, run just on this and win?
Well, eventually they will, right? And so that's why I actually have a lot of hope, even though things seem super dark right now. So, and that's why I was for Bernie. So I can come back to that. But why hasn't Trump done it is easy. He's like, what am I, a sucker? The guy gives me money. I do what the guy wants. Why would I get rid of that? That's how I got into power. And so that's how I'm doing it now. I go to Miriam Mendelsohn and say, give me $100 million and I'll let Israel annex the West Bank, right? So I'll go to the oil companies and give me $1 billion and I'll give you tax subsidies. I'll let you drill. I'll take away regulation. Why would I stop that?
You think he likes money more than he likes being popular? Because there's a big part of him that's a populist in the sense that like he loves being admired by large masses of people.
Yeah. So, and you're absolutely right, but that is the fault of MAGA. And so MAGA, you're screwing populists in a way that is infuriating. Okay. And smart libertarians like Dave Smith have figured this out. And that's why he's just as mad at Trump as I am. And it's because he took a populist movement and he redirected it for his own personal gain. MAGA, figure it out. Come on, right? And so if you say, oh, you think Democrats have figured out that these politics... No, they largely haven't figured it out either. And I think there's blue MAGA, and I could talk about that as well. But for those of us on the populist left, yeah, we're not enamored by politicians. And for example, when Bernie does the wrong thing, we call him out. Well, Bernie's not my goddamn uncle. I don't like him for some personality reason. It's not a cult of personality. You do the right thing, I love you for. You do the wrong thing, I'm going to kick your ass for it, right? So, but Donald Trump does this massive, ridiculous corruption over and over again. And MAGA's like, I'm here for it, love it. As long as you're doing the corruption, I'm okay with it.
What does Trump say about getting money out of politics? He
says nothing about it. Go ahead, MAGA, why haven't you held him to account? Like, so when Bernie it helped Biden take out $15 minimum wage from the Senate bill on the first bill that was introduced in the Biden administration, we went nuts. We did a petition. We sent in videos to Bernie, our audience going, don't kill it, Bernie, don't kill it. And so Bernie then reintroduced it as an amendment. It got voted down, but he did the right thing, right? That is us holding our top leader accountable and saying, you better get back on track, okay? Because we're not here for you and your personal self-aggrandizement. We're here for policy, right? And if MAGA was actually here for policy, they would have absolutely leveled Trump on the fact that remember what he ran on, drain the swamp. That's why he won in 2016, right? I predicted on ABC right after the DNC, and Hillary Clinton was up 10, 12 points, whatever she was, and I said Trump would win, okay? And the whole panel laughed out loud, right? They're like, get a load of this crazy guy. I said he's a populist who seems to hate the establishment in a populist time. And drain the swamp is a great slogan. And I knew he would win when he was in a Republican debate, and he said, I paid all these guys. Before, I paid them and they did whatever I wanted. And I was like, that's so true, right? And people will love that, and especially Republican voters will love that. I actually have a lot of respect for Republican voters because they actually genuinely hate corruption.
That's a lot. It's a lot to digest. I think it's interesting to hear whatever you want to say about Cenk Uygur and the Young Turks and Ana Kasparian. Cenk Uygur has been doing this for a long time. And I think Cenk Uygur is convinced that he is right. I don't think he's been accused of being a shill or a fraud or a phony or gaming this. I don't think any of that's true about Cenk. I don't necessarily agree with all of Cenk Uygur's views, and I don't know that you can build a bridge between this supposed populist right and the populist left. I think that they're fundamentally coming at it from two different angles. But to be fair, Cenk Uygur has more experience in this than I do and has been following politics more closely than I have. So, I'll just leave that there. But what he talks about money and politics and sort of how we got here, I think is really fascinating. And I would love to know what you all think in the comments, please.